In today's video, we dive straight into the quiet coup unfolding at Fairmont Crest. Leslie believes she's found a golden clue, a crisp folder that seems to link John's casino ledgers to a shadowy medical supplier and a too-perfect storage log near the hospital. While Lauren drowns in grief and Alex hunts for patterns, Danny and Anita recalibrate every alliance they've built, unaware that the board is already shifting under their feet. What looks like leverage begins to smell like choreography, and the evidence that lifts Leslie up may be the very net designed to catch her on the way down. Stay with me as we trace the past that planted suspicion, the present that mistakes momentum for power, and the bleak future where manipulated proof drains reputation and turns trust into the rarest currency. Hit subscribe, we're starting now. The story does not begin with the clue, it begins with the need for one. Long before the streets around Fairmont Crest grew heavy with whispers, Leslie learned to survive by rearranging small truths into shields. She understood that in a community where grief masqueraded as etiquette and power dressed itself in charity galas, leverage mattered more than good intentions. She watched families curate reputations like museum pieces, and she watched those displays crack whenever money, love, or legacy shifted even an inch. She watched Lauren carry sorrow as if it were unpaid interest. She watched John skim the surface of danger with the ease of a man who knew every corridor in a casino and every corridor inside a person's fear. She watched Alex test the edges of loyalty, willing to bruise himself on them if that helped him touch whatever had gone missing when loss moved in and unpacked its boxes. Somewhere in that tangle, Leslie decided she would not be collateral again. The past weeks made that decision feel almost rational. A memorial widened old fractures. A business deal led a rumor through the door. A late-night visit led to a morning of rueful silence. The current of events pushed everyone toward a different shoreline than the one they had mapped. In that drift, Leslie kept notebooks, simple, unassuming, stuffed with times, faces, the shapes of envelopes, the order in which phones lit up during a crisis. She did not think of it as surveillance. She thought of it as replacing the soft comfort of assumptions with the hard comfort of timelines. When the night came that changed everything, it did not arrive with drama, it arrived with a file that made sense of a pattern she had only felt. The file was inelegant, a mismatched folder, crisp pages like a too bright smile. It had numbers that linked the casino's private ledgers to a medical supply vendor that recently bloomed behind the hospital's neatly audited exterior. It had signatures that were almost right. It had the name of a shell corporation that appeared once in a zoning appeal and once on a list of anonymous donors who loved to be thanked but hated to be seen. It had a date stamp that landed between two events that should never have been neighbors. It was, to a hungry mind, the click of a lock. To Leslie, it sang of opportunity, of the kind that might reorder the small wars that kept Fairmont Crest obedient to a rotating set of kings. The power of that discovery was not in what it proved but in what it suggested could be proven next. Leslie recognized the seduction immediately. She set out not to shout but to arrange pressure points. She let a helpful morsel reach Danny, who shared it with Anita, who considered its usefulness as if weighing a jewel for flaws. She allowed a different morsel to brush past Nicole, whose skepticism could strip the varnish off any claim, which made her the ideal first audience. She dipped a third morsel toward Vernon, not because he would act on it but because he would calculate it, and calculations leave trails for people like John to notice. In a place where a whisper travels faster than a siren, Leslie understood that creating a pattern of notice was a way of measuring the truth without getting caught holding it. What she measured first was the speed at which calm phrase under implied exposure. Meetings were suddenly shorter. Promises suddenly came with commas. Ted moved carefully around Carlton, and careful movement telegraphed anxiety. Martin performed bright remorse under the dull lamps of reputation, and Smitty wrapped himself in a new stoicism that did not quite hide the tremor of someone who has gambled on love and is waiting for the turn of a card. Kat wore composure like armor, Eva wore determination like perfume. Tomas tried to outrun gossip, which only made gossip keep pace. Lauren, tired of breathing grief in a room that refused to open a window, drifted nearer to silence, and silence is where regret grows teeth. Alex paced the perimeter of every story with the impatience of someone who keeps finding locked doors. In all of that, Leslie felt a dangerous clarity. She was no longer observing the board, she was touching it. Touching the board, however, is how a person becomes visible to the hands that set it. Small anomalies announced themselves as if they had been waiting for her attention. The vendor's address resolved into an office that had no lights on, then into a mailbox that had too many keys. The donor list, once static, gained a duplicate entry with a different middle initial. The date stamp that had quickened her pulse was 2 minutes too convenient, as if a clock had been turned backward in a room with one window and no witnesses. These were details that could be explained, but collectively they had the odor of manufactured coincidence. Leslie understood the difference between a puzzle and a trap. A puzzle rewards curiosity, a trap flatters it. She tried to step back. She tried to treat the folder as a map, not a mandate. Yet every instinct honed by years of being underestimated urged her forward. Pressure, applied correctly, could force a real link to reveal itself. She decided the safest way to apply it would be to let the right people think they were one step ahead. She placed an innocuous inquiry with a city clerk who owed her a favor and told him only half of what she needed. She visited the hospital wing no one photographs and asked benign questions about inventory. She let a casino staffer see her leave by the side exit reserved for guests who prefer shadows to spotlights. She hoped the observers behind the observation would believe she was a collector of shards, not the builder of a mirror. What followed looked like progress. The vendor's registration updated itself to include a second officer, and that officer's first name matched a name that had once hovered at the edges of John's operations. A dormant foundation made a tiny grant to a neighborhood program favored by Lauren, as if someone were laundering remorse through goodwill. A private message arrived through a third party offering to exchange context for a guarantee of discretion, which sounded like the beginning of leverage, which sounded like the beginning of a win. Leslie felt the tempo rise, she felt the plot lean toward her. She did not notice, not then, how neatly her steps fell into a path someone else had swept clean. The last act of ascent happened quickly. A cross-reference linked the shell company to a courier firm that had serviced deliveries coinciding with nights when the casino's quiet rooms were less quiet. A second cross-reference tied that courier to off-site storage holding medical devices that did not match the hospital's procurement catalogs. A third cross-reference, this one from an anonymous inbox, tied the storage access to a name that would ignite a civil war if spoken aloud in the wrong kitchen. It was combustible, and combustible things make people feel powerful. Leslie felt it. She felt the city tilt in her favor, as if a secret wind were finally blowing from behind. She did not, could not, see the angle of the blade hiding in that wind. The file she treated as a key was also a lure. The path she read as initiative was also choreography. She was not the first to take these precise steps. She was merely the next. The first sign was not dramatic, it was administrative. A polite request arrived for Leslie to clarify a records inquiry she had never submitted. It carried the tone of bureaucratic patience and the precision of a warning shot. Within hours, a second signal appeared in the form of a security log from storage that placed her access badge near a unit she had never visited. The log included timestamp, camera reference, a tidy thumbnail that resembled her profile at a distance and a stranger at arm's length. Evidence, she understood, is often a story with pictures. The social layer changed next. People who had been comfortably curious shifted into rehearsed neutrality. Carlton displayed the serene ineffability of a man who knew a meeting would go his way before it started. Ted moved with a focus that suggested he had no room left in his day for improvisation. Martin's contrition regained a scripted sheen, and Smitty closed the curtain on sympathy to preserve what he could of a wounded routine. Danny and Anita treated information like glassware, they touched it gently, arranged it tastefully, and removed it before anyone grew attached. Naomi vanished into practical tasks that smelled like preparation. Jacob began to look everywhere except where anyone pointed. The pattern was unmistakable, the board had rotated, and Leslie was finding herself on the wrong side of the squares. The reversal came into full color on a weekday afternoon when a city compliance memo named her as the originator of a chain of requests that mirrored her private research but altered the sequence just enough to fabricate intent. Paired with the storage log and an anonymous affidavit citing a woman matching her description transferring a sealed case from a courier to a hospital lift, the narrative took shape without her. She felt the sick elasticity of being turned into a character in someone else's careful outline. The same precision that had impressed her in the file now arranged her life into paragraphs with numbered exhibits. She tested for allies. Nicole's eyes had nothing to borrow. Vernon had already classified the risk and fenced it in. Kat was busy subsisting on willpower, which left little left over for lending. Eva was too far into her own salvage operation to help another diver. Tomas, unreliable even to himself, offered chaos rather than cover. Lauren, whose grief never stopped counting, could not afford a new debt to despair. Alex, living on the edge of a crusade, could not be seen stepping toward a suspect without torching his own ground. John, the most dangerous of them all, registered the shift with a courtesy that felt colder than contempt. If there was help to be had, it would not announce itself. The trap's artistry lay in how it inverted her virtues. Her patience became stalking. Her note-keeping became conspiring. Her insistence on pattern became obsession. The same folder that had promised to reorder small wars now made her the spark of a larger one. And the chorus that always arrives when a community senses blood appeared on cue, a handful of well-timed leaks, a clipped rumor about extortion, a suggestion that she had been paid to smear a pillar in order to reroute contracts. Even her silence was interpreted for her. She learned quickly that the less she said, the cleaner the accusations looked, and the more she spoke, the more she sounded like the kind of person who had rehearsed goodness to hide intent. By the time she parsed the forgery, an expertly manipulated metadata chain that pinned a series of edits to her device during a window when her phone had been in airplane mode. The institutions had already done what institutions do when narrative outruns nuance. Doors that had opened for years required appointments. Appointments that had been perfunctory now needed agendas. Agendas required sponsors who suddenly had scheduling conflicts. She still had her name, but names are collateral until someone decides to cash them in. The personal losses began as hairline fractures and widened into unwalkable rooms. The neighbor who used to ask for garden tips stopped making eye contact. The coffee place with the soft lighting and comfortable corners grew brisk in its service and exact in its receipts. The few friends who had learned to keep secrets promised nothing and kept that promise. In the hours when the city quieted, sleep traded places with replay, and replay never negotiates. She replayed the file, the clerk, the storage log, the anonymous message, the courier name, the flattering speed with which her research had become leads. The story reassembled itself in a cruelly logical order. Someone had studied her hunger and set the table accordingly. What makes despair efficient is not a single catastrophe, it is the convergence of small inevitabilities that leave a person without angles. The compliance inquiry became a formal review. The formal review became a referral. The referral became a conversation she could not attend because the conversation was about her, and people rarely invite the accused to help outline the indictment. She imagined who sat at that table and which version of her they needed her to be. She knew how quickly a face can calcify into an archetype once a room agrees to it. The last illusions fell during a meeting in a glass-walled office where everything looks honest. The official phrases arrived, softened by careful vowels. Reputational concerns, process integrity, safeguarding partnerships. Each phrase drew a circle around the same absence. There would be no shield for her here. When she stepped back into the corridor, Fairmont Crest's climate-controlled air tasted like a winter she had not prepared for. The city outside the elevator was the same city as yesterday. She was the thing rearranged. If there was a final gesture of mercy, it came in the form of belated clarity. She saw the fingerwork behind the trick. The ledger links, the donor echo, the courier loop, the storage log, none of them needed to be true in order to be useful. They needed only to be plausible long enough for the room to shift its weight. Someone, call it a single strategist, call it a coordinated instinct, understood that the fastest way to neutralize a person who trades in patterns is to give her a perfect one that collapses under verification, and to schedule the collapse for the exact moment when her curiosity becomes her alibi. The timing was immaculate. The lesson was brutal. There is a version of this story where Leslie finds an unlikely ally, where a stray camera angle catches the wrist of the real courier, where a vendor's invoice exposes the forgery, where a clerk's conscience remembers a request they never processed. There is a version where patience is rewarded and the trap becomes a case study rather than a cauterized wound. But the path she set in motion shows a darker efficiency. The ally arrived late, the camera was down for maintenance, the invoice was reconciled by someone who liked their job a little too much, and the clerk decided that memory without documentation is just theater. When the spiral reached its quietest point, Leslie understood that failing loudly might have been kinder. Quiet failure forces a person to converse with the echo of their own intention. She had wanted to be the kind of force that makes a map more honest. She had wanted to prove that leverage could be used to pry open a window, not lock a door. She had wanted to show a city built on careful performances that truth could be staged without props. Instead, she had learned the cost of being legible to the wrong audience at the wrong time. The board had rotated, and she had been beautiful prey. The future did not promise redemption. It promised paperwork, and then the smaller humiliations that always accompany it. It promised that John would continue to move like a man who never misplaces a receipt. It promised that Lauren would choose the kind of peace that people earn after they stop expecting fairness. It promised that Alex would keep hunting, because some people do not know how to stop once they start. It promised that Danny and Anita would speak in the curate's language of stability while calculating where to stack the next set of boxes. It promised that Martin and Smitty would survive each other long enough to decide whether survival counts as love. It promised that Ted would thread needles, that Carlton would collect them. It promised that Kat would endure, that Eva would insist, that Tomas would learn too late what it means to keep a promise to yourself when everyone else needs one from you. For Leslie, it promised an inventory of losses arranged in tidy rows. Credibility is not a thing you lose in an instant, it is a currency you discover you can no longer spend. The clue that elevated her had been engineered to do so. It carried her high enough to see the city clearly and then cut the railing where she leaned. On the way down, perspective becomes a kind of cruelty. She saw exactly how the play had been designed, where she had nodded along to its tempo, and where she might have stepped sideways and did not. She saw, too, that her ruin had been useful to someone else's stability, and in Fairmont Crest, usefulness is often the holiest sin. When the camera fades at the end of the video, nothing explodes. That is the final indignity. The ending is not spectacle, it is erosion. A woman who learned to survive by arranging truths into shields was handed a truth with beveled edges and told it was a sword. She lifted it, and the handle turned to smoke. The lesson is not that curiosity kills, the lesson is that in a city of curated lives, truth requires handlers, and the handlers do not recruit from the ranks of those who need it most. In the quiet after the credits, the only sound is paper sliding back into a file that never needed to exist, and footsteps leaving a room where a decision has already been made. And that brings us to the final turn of the screw. Leslie thought she could convert a clean stack of numbers into oxygen, but the city answered with paperwork that breathes only when someone else permits it. The file that once felt like ascent now sits like ballast, dragging her to a depth where even clarity sounds muffled. John continues to glide through corridors that were built for his stride, his ledgers immaculate, his alibis curated, his silence is more persuasive than most people's speeches. Lauren learns to ration her grief so it does not bankrupt the days ahead, and in that frugal quiet she becomes untouchable to rumors yet unreachable to rescue. Alex keeps tracing the outline of a pattern that almost closes, almost proves, almost saves, until the word almost becomes its own prison. Danny and Anita fine-tune alliances with the grace of seasoned curators, adjusting the lighting on relationships so the flaws are less visible, the fractures less alarming, the risks less taxable. Vernon measures outcomes, Nicole measures costs, and together they teach the community how to survive scandal by starving it of spectacle. Carlton gathers needles, Ted threads them through deals that avoid names and prefer initials. Martin bargains with penance, Smitty bargains with time, and both discover that endurance is not forgiveness, only a long hallway where the door at the end keeps receding. Kat armors composure, Eva rehearses resolve, Tomas tries to outrun his shadow and keeps discovering it is faster in daylight than at dusk. For Leslie, the path forward.